Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new edition of the History Made Awesome podcast here on History Made Awesome. And as always, I am joined by my co-host, Daniel. Say hi, Dan.
Hello.
And now our next guest is a person who's been an amazing mentor and resource for me on my journey to become an historian. This person is none other than the magnificent Dr. Katie Stirling-Harris, Associate Professor of History at UC Davis. Hi, Professor Harris, and thank you for joining the program.
Hey there. Nice to be here.
Now, Professor Harris, can you introduce everyone, who you are, what's your research, and what are you doing right now?
Well, I am a specialist in 16th and 17th century Spanish histories, but that's Spanish writ large, so that tends to flop over into the Spanish colonies in different ways. And I work primarily on cultural history, and especially on religious history. And my work for many years has centered mainly on, frankly, on dead bodies. I work on relics, the Catholic cult of relics, and associated phenomena associated with that. So,
And then what kind of classes do you teach at UC Davis?
Oh, well, I, at the introductory level, I regularly teach a world history class. That's a lot of fun. And gives me a lot of challenges. And at the upper division level and at the graduate level, I teach European history for the most part. Although some of that teaching, as I said, flops over into other parts of the world. The geographic boundaries are artificial. And while my training is largely in Europe, it's not exclusively so. So I teach a course on Spain and the Americas in the 16th century. I teach a course on the Reformations, so Protestant and Catholic in the 16th and 17th centuries. Graduate stuff, it's all over the map. So yeah, that's generally what I do.
Yeah. So actually, and then also you were working on, I feel like you just published recently a chapter, right? Titled Stolen Saints, Relic, Theft, and Relic Identification in 17th Century Rome. And the book to which your chapter is found in is called The Quest for Certainty in Early Modern Europe, from Inquisition to Inquiry, 1550 to 1700.
Yeah, that came out recently. It's a chapter in a collected volume of essays about the problem or the crisis of uncertainty in early modern Europe, especially in the 17th century, in a period in which a lot of old certainties, things that people had been sure of, were really no longer quite sure. And so you might think of well, I mean, some of the obvious ones, right? When Columbus bumbles out into the ocean and bumps into a continent that nobody knew was there, or no Europeans knew was there, right? That's confusing. And it takes Europeans a long time to wrap their heads around it in fully, right? And what all of it means. That's one example. Or the kinds of upheavals that come with religious reform, the Protestant Reformations, the Catholic Reformations, that mean that there is increasingly people have to live in a situation in which there's no single religious truth, right? So that's uncertainty. Or another example would be the kind of massive inflation experienced in Europe in the 16th century. Economics was in its, barely in its infancy in this period, and people had to really struggle with the idea that gold in particular, which was a substance that people tended to think of as a fixed value, that it might not be, right? And how is it that prices went skyrocketing and through the roof? How does that work, and how to fix it? So uncertainties of every kind. And so the volume that I published in is different essays on different topics that try to address the way that early modern Europeans wrapped their heads around uncertainty and found ways to deal with it. So.
And then also, so I know one of also PhD research also deals with, identity and something that's follows throughout your entire kind of academic career, the things you've published. And it's
Hmm.
interesting enough, I think just kind of give an insight to kind of how I came to know you, Professor, and kind of my first interaction with you is I believe I took your I forget what the seminar was called. It was something called, it was identity, I
It was
think.
on, I think it was a seminar on imposters and identity, dissimulation, and people claiming to be things other than what they were, which, everybody does, but there's a lot of hand-wringing about it in
Mhm.
the early modern period. If you think
Yeah.
about, it's a theme in a lot of plays and a lot of literature of the period. So we weren't looking at literature because I feel on shaky ground when I try to do literary stuff.
Mhm.
But so exploring that. Mhm.
Yeah, and so like one of the coolest, like I guess one thing that I kind of got out of it that was just kind of like just blew my mind. Do you still? I'm not sure if you still teach that seminar, but do you remember this? You probably do remember this book, but it's "Who You Are" by Valentine Grosvenor. I'll just show
Oh
everyone.
yeah, that's a fantastic book. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm actually teaching that seminar right now. We're in the 7th week, but I couldn't assign Grosvenor because it wasn't available online
uh,
because COVID has thrown everybody's syllabus into complete disarray, and a lot of the things that we would normally teach we can't. So it didn't use that book, unfortunately.
but
I
yeah,
really,
like
really like it.
yeah, I know. I was just like, because it was cool because we got to see kind of how, identity kind of ebbs and flows, and what we consider to be like a person or who a person is not always stays the same, especially whatever within whatever context that person is. And I think because you ended the entire like seminar with this book, and
Mhm.
what I like about it is like you kind of see kind of this flows of what we've been talking about, but then we get to see like this modern side of identity making. And I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of preconceived notions that like in the modern kind of world, like everything's kind of perfect, how like we're able to identify someone like easily and stuff like that. But when you find out there's as many flaws within the modern sense of identification as there kind of is in early modern Europe, or just early modern world. At least that's how I can do it. And like the modern world is not like so
Well,
perfect.
I think anybody who's had their identity stolen online, right? Every time there's another data breach, we all learn about just how um, wobbly that edifice is. That
Hmm.
that increasingly, if you're the identity markers, I mean, identity markers in terms of how you identify yourself are one thing, right?
Hmm.
But the identity markers that are demanded and imposed and tracked by, especially by the state, that's another thing, right?
Hmm.
And so we all have learned precisely how limited and problematic it is when social security numbers, credit scores, all of that stuff. Um, those the it's all part, I mean, apparatus of the modern state, exactly, right? And
Hmm.
so for the early modern, we weren't dealing with a period in which we have the state operating at the same level. So that
Hmm.
made it kind of fun, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so like I just like blew my mind like how I think about like the modern world. And it's funny. I was so kind of inspired by the book. I brought it with me when I went to Buffalo. I was like, I got to bring that book with me in case I need to look at it for inspiration. So thank you, Professor, for bringing that up and helping with me introduce that to us.
Yeah, it
Um,
was a good read.
So before we get anything to it, I think we should just go. Dan, you ready to go? Oh, okay.
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, sounds good. So what I kind of want to do, Professor, is to kind of give people kind of a sense of how history works, and kind of bridge the gap between what we do as academics and kind of the local, like the public, in a sense, and try
Hmm.
to make history cool and interesting. So what I kind of want to do is think. So, Professor, we talk about your first book that you published in 2007, titled "From Muslims to Christian Granada: Inventing a City's Past in Early Modern Spain."
Hmm.
And then we can kind of talk about how this book has kind of informed your most recent work. Kind of where do you
Oh
see the
yeah.
connections, and kind of how has that kind of driven you forward? Um, so if you're cool, we can talk about that, Professor.
Sure. Yeah. That book is getting kind of old and crusty now, but
Yeah, definitely.
it's a little tired. So that book, that was grows out of my doctoral dissertation, and is there is a very clear and logical connection between what I'm doing now and that book. And very basically, that book deals with a series of discoveries that were found in the Spanish city of Granada, which is in southern Spain. And these are discoveries that were made in 1588 and in 1595 and the years following. And what was found were a series of documents, a few in Latin, but mostly these were in Arabic and inscribed in Arabic on little lead plates I've seen them, they're about this big, right?
Yeah.
And accompanying probably human remains that were understood to be the remains of saints, so relics. And these documents were purportedly from the 1st century AD. So, in the first half of the first century, no, second half of the first century. And anybody who knows even the slightest bit about medieval European history knows that this is a problem. That is, you can't have documents in Arabic in the Iberian Peninsula in the 1st century. That's not possible, because it's not until, of course, the year, easily remembered year 711, that we have the entrance of forces from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula and the spread of Arabic into the Iberian Peninsula. So this is a kind of astonishing anachronism, but it all begins to make sense when you understand that Granada is, of course, the city as a city, but also as a kingdom. The kingdom of Granada was the last outpost of Islam, independent Islam, in the Iberian Peninsula, and falls to the forces, the combined forces of Ferdinand and Isabel. This is the same people that funded Columbus, right? Falls to them in 1492. So 1492 is kind of a big year. And the first thing that happens in 1492 is that the city of Granada, and thus the kingdom of Granada, is absorbed by Castile, the kingdom of Castile. And so you understand it, if you put it into that context, you start to understand what that is all about. And these documents and the relics as well are, needless to say, forgeries. And we don't know exactly who the author of the forgeries was. There are some recent work that makes some very good cases for the identities of the creators of these documents. But they are very probably members of the Morisco minority. That is a group of people within the community who are the descendants of Muslims forcibly converted, for the most part, to Catholic Christianity. And at the end of the 16th century, Granada, which had been, of course, a city of Muslims, had been forcibly, by this time, had been forcibly converted to Catholicism, and was also undergoing a process of what amounts to it's colonization, right? That it's being colonized by people coming from northern Spain, and the Morisco population was more and more under stress and pressure from this incoming group, and also the focus of a lot of animosity more generally across Spain. And it was beginning to be bandied about at court and other places that perhaps a solution to the Morisco problem would be expulsion from the peninsula, as had happened to the Jews in 1492. And so it is most probable that these objects were created in an effort to legitimize Morisco culture, Morisco language in the eyes of this hostile population. In the long run, of course, it doesn't work. The Moriscos are, in fact, expelled from Spain in 1609 and the years following. But if you put it into that climate, it makes much more sense as to what they are. And so what that book does is examines the finds, not as much, I don't take it so much from the direction of looking at it as within Morisco culture. I'm not a specialist on Moriscos, although I you know, I've done a lot of reading since then. I don't know Arabic, so I'm not in the position to do that work. There are lots of people who've done that work and they've done it very well. So that was not an appropriate thing for me to do. But what the book does is instead is look at how the finds, both the relics and the documents, are used by people in Granada to rewrite the city's history along Christian lines, basically taking a city that was the emblematic city of Iberian Islam and turning it into a city that makes this claim for being, you know, who's the most Christian? We're the most Christian. Never mind all that, you know, Moorish architecture. We're the most Christian, and here's the proof, right? So it looks at the way that they are deployed within local culture. So that means writing histories, new histories of the city, rewriting the city's history along Christian lines. It means ways that they get kind of deployed into local festivals. So for example, every year, including now, it still happens, and it's super interesting if you ever get to go. Yeah. Okay. There is every January 2nd, and there has been since the early 16th century, there is something called Dia de la Toma. And that is the commemoration of the capture of the city by the Catholic forces of Ferdinand Isabel, right? And what one of the chapters does in this book is look at the way that sermons given as part of the celebration deployed this new history that was grounded in these documents. If you ever get to go and see this celebration now, it is absolutely fascinating because it is, as you can imagine, it is, of course, you know, this is a deeply political event. And it is the site of a lot of struggles, contemporary struggles about what is the nature of the history that Granadinos should remember. What is the place of Islam in Granadino history, right? So you get a lot of competing parties at the celebration. In fact, it's a protest site, right? So you'll have on one side of the plaza, you'll have like ultra right wing political groups, and then on the other side you'll have like leftist groups, and there's usually a good space between them, and you can tell by what they're saying and the attitudes that their commentary from the crowd, and there's also it's super interesting, the what are they called, the tercios, the sort of famous military group that is associated with Spain's colonial enterprise in Morocco. They're always amazing to see. I mean, they're very much tend to be associated with right-wing politics. They're amazing because their dress uniform, these are always like big burly dudes, right? Their dress uniform is like the tightest shirt you can imagine. It's always open to here. And they're like coming down, and all the right-wing ladies are always going, guapo, guapo. And that's not what the left-wing ladies are saying, but so it's like super politicized in a really interesting, visible way. The local Muslim community usually from what I haven't seen it in many years, but for the local Muslim community, it's also a moment of a lot of tension, right? Do you come out to the thing? What does it mean to you, right? There's a mosque, a new mosque was built in Granada I think it's at least 10 years old now, but it took decades for there to be a new mosque for this growing community, both immigrant and native Spaniards, because there was so much hand-wringing over what does it mean to have a viable mosque in Granada, right? It's a really big deal. It's a pretty mosque if you go. It's really like it's pretty. It's up in Albaicin, but it's also the site of a lot of anxiety. So anyway, that's a discursus on the Toma. But if you get to go, it's super interesting, and it's like seeing contemporary Spanish politics, but also the meanings of history kind of laid out in front of you in this really super easily read way.
So a couple of things I kind of want to just kind of like look under the hood for this kind of research. I think one thing you're trying to do with this book is trying to like show, well, before I get to that, I think there's like three themes that I kind of see within this book. To me, I think there are, memory, identity, and kind of a sense of where Spanish nationalism comes from, or at least maybe just nationalisms in general. I'm not sure if that's what the case, but we can maybe talk about those as we continue this conversation. I think the first thing I kind of want to ask is, why did you choose Granada as the source of your research? One specific city.
Because for a couple of reasons, because I was already interested in this particular set of finds, and that's where they happened, right? And they happened there because of the place that it is. So I did my doctoral work at Johns Hopkins University, and at Johns Hopkins, the history program requires you to, well, it's a very quick, well, the coursework part is quick and like unrelenting, but it's brutal. But in the first year, graduate students are required to produce a publishable quality article length research paper, right? And in some ways it's really, really hard because you don't know what the hell you're doing. You're just learning your craft. But in some ways it's super good thing to do because it's like an up or out thing, right? Did you enjoy it? Good. Did you hate it? Now you know, right? Don't waste your life doing something that it turns out you absolutely hate. So there's a value to that. It turns out I liked it. And I produced out of that first year experience, I wrote a paper that turned out to be my first published article on, and that's an analysis of I want to say 1638 history of Granada and the way that these finds were deployed in the history. So it was already set, I was already ready to roll. But Granada itself, also part of the reason is I got some very good advice from my dissertation director. And he said, and this is Richard Kagan, who is a huge name in my field, right? Like there's a handful of stars, superstars, and he's one of them. And he said, don't pick some ugly industrial town. You're going to have to go live there. It should be pretty, And he has a point, right? There's a time and a place to go live in the ugly town that has a rich history, but like it's hideous now. And there are those places, but Granada is not one. So it's really, really beautiful there. And I'm not going to say it has an exciting nightlife, God, this is a long time ago now. So what do I know? Like anything I say is probably wrong now, but I wasn't there for the nightlife, right? So it was an extremely beautiful place to be. If you're going to go be a, confused, lost graduate student with no clue as to what the hell you're doing, you might as well do it somewhere pretty. So Granada was the logical place, and it turned out to have ample sources for me.
Yeah, and I think also, well, before I get to that, so Dan, you might want to listen up and because he studies U.S. history, so you have to find a pretty place in the U.S. Dan, if you want to study Civil War. I don't know what place that's going to be, but try your best.
I will look for a beautiful place.
Sounds good, mate. Sounds good. Um, I think one thing to try to do with this book is like look at how people identify themselves, and you do that through like how they remember like pieces of their past, either through like, well, you don't really go much into. You touch a little bit about like architecture and art at turn pieces, but for you, it's really kind of the histories that they write about themselves.
Yeah.
And the Plomos is kind of that big piece of it. And what I kind of get from it is I think Granada is a really good place to kind of look at this kind of place because it's like it's relatively recent, so there's a lot of stuff to kind of find there. But also, it's like the Plomos is like this brilliant document that allows people to kind of create these new histories about themselves that they didn't have before. I mean, it's not even for Granada, just as like during the time, like the text was just espoused so many different ideas about Christianity and what it means to be Christian, just outside of Granada. So I think in that sense, I guess to kind of connect the question, how does the Plomos kind of help discern how people identify themselves in that connection to how Grenadians try to develop a new sense of themselves after the Spanish Reconquista, and in the midst of trying to rewrite themselves over an Islamic past that's existed in that city until the late 17th century, when I think the Plomos were found.
No, it's the 16th century. So so the Plomos is I should say, like, that's the kind of collective term for the documents and the relics, right? And it means, it's like saying the leads, right? And it's a reference to the lead tablets themselves. I think that in some ways it's a little misleading. A lot of histories that have a deep roots in the Islamic past were doing the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So if you look to, for example, Cordoba. Cordoba was, of course, the seat of the Cordoban Caliphate in Al-Andalus. You can ask for deeper roots in Islam. I mean, Cordoba is also a Roman city. Granada doesn't have that particularly. Granada is actually, by comparison, quite young. But it's a kind of negotiation with a past that was not, in the minds of 16th and 17th century Spaniards, that's not an acceptable past, right? That's a past that does not sit well, because there's, you have this legacy of hundreds and hundreds of years of military struggle against Islamic states in the southern part of the peninsula, it's a very, I mean, in part, there's a kind of element of like, look at these beautiful buildings that were built by the emirs of Granada, right? Those are important. They are beautiful, but they're also just really problematic. Like how these Catholic Granadinos are like, I don't know, I'm not really comfortable with that building that has Arabic writing on it, right? So there's a kind of split aspect to it. So it's not just Granada that's trying to contend with it, but the Plomos are it's interesting because it's a Morisco project, right? To try to make Morisco culture understandable, palatable to the non-Morisco population, right? And that's the part that my book deals with, but only briefly. Because I don't have the resources, I don't have the tools to do that work. But it's a Morisco project that gets, in a sense, co-opted and deployed by a non-Morisco population in ways that don't necessarily reflect entirely the goals of what the probable goals of the forgers, right? So every project can get picked up and used in ways that the originator doesn't necessarily have in mind. This is a really good example of it. So, and what you see in the histories and the sermons and the devotions that develop around it, and the maps that are created and the depictions that are created. You see a kind of reworking of the local history in which it's almost like, 700-800 years of Islam is like this blip, right?
Yeah.
It's a blip, and that gets talked about. They don't go, if you read the histories, they don't go through all of the rulers. I mean, how that stuff gets mentioned, but in context of what does it mean for Christians, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, because one thing you do talk about is that you're not talking about like the identity of Grenadians in all, like what is Grenadian or whatever, but you talk about like one specific aspect that is like their Christian kind of identity, and how that kind of reflects on their I guess could you say that Christian? Because you try to say you're not trying to explain all the identities, right? Because identity is a very kind of very mixed jumble thing and have multiple meanings. But you kind of look at this Christian identity because it's something that is it's not all of it, but it's a very important part of how people in that time kind of describe themselves and express who they are, right?
Correct. Yeah. No, there would be too diffuse and too much to talk about whose identity when, how, right? And those, you also have to think about you can only do so much in a book, right? No book can be everything to all people. And so you have to make your choices. And it would be a very different book if I tried to talk about what does it mean to be a Morisca woman in Granada, or what does it mean to be an old person in the city, right? Those are potentially different identities, but that's a completely different set of questions, right? The other thing is that the sources for talking about this are, at least for me at the time, this is a long time ago, this is research that was done a long time ago, were richer and more viable to me than some of the kinds of sources that I would need to talk about other kinds of identities, right? Because you always have to keep in mind your sources and whether they're going to give, like, how to get what you want out of them, whether that's even possible, and whether you, honest to God, have the time, right? Because I was there as I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright grant. So I had a full year funded. Okay, that's 1 year. You better do it all, right? And some sources are more easily yield their secrets faster than others. So it made more sense for me to try to use my limited time and funds on material that I could work with, rather than, for example, I was warned away from, and I think it was good advice, don't use the notarial records. And the reason for that is notarial records are amazing, right? They are contracts, they are wills, they are things like that. However, the way that notarial records are organized in Spanish notarial archives, you get a bundle. I'm looking around trying to find an example of something that would serve. You get a bundle of documents. It's like this high, right? And it's like a stack of paper, and it's tied with a ribbon. Okay, that's called a legajo. Okay, this is not indexed.
Oh, snap. That's a lot of looking through.
Okay, and they're organized by the notary, not by the year. So I am looking for, if I want to look at the notarial records between, say, 1590 and 1620, if I really wanted to do all of that work, I have to go through the records of, scribe A, scribe B, scribe C, scribe D. Okay, they are not index, because that's a huge amount of work. Who has the time for that?
Yeah.
Right. There's still the archivists are doing amazing work, and they work incredibly hard, but there are no indexes, or if there are indexes, right, these are indexes that were created in the 17th or the 18th century. So they're not necessarily organized in ways that meet my needs, right? They meet they meet the needs of some other bureaucratic entity, right? Never mind. I mean, the fact that these are handwritten, that's not even like whatever. Okay. So you just throw out your fancy ideas of things being on the internet. There is no internet. Okay. So that you have to keep that in mind. And then notarial manuscripts are written in a hand that is going to make your eyes bleed. Because it's really, really hard to read often, right? If I knew that I was going to do this, I'd have a prop, but basically like notarial hand in, say, late 16th century Spanish looks like loop to loop to loop to loop.
Oh, Jesus.
Loop, right?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of grammar. There's not a lot of punctuation. Okay. So it's incredibly time consuming. It's exhausting. Right. And if I was from Granada and I lived there and I could go every day for like 2 hours, then maybe, right? But as a foreigner coming in, I have this much money and I have this much time. Don't do it. You have to like make strategic choices. So that's just wasn't feasible, just like for very concrete reasons. Notarial records are super amazing if you have the time.
Exactly. Before we move on, Dan, do you have any questions or anything we should clarify before we continue on?
No, all of it's been pretty concise.
Oh, sweet. Good. Very good. So we talk about the Flomos. We talk about, what they do. So I guess one thing is, you use this as like a very good tool that they use throughout your research. I can definitely see how it works. But you kind of talk a little bit about how these documents, how they helped like these writers, right? These thinkers start to write these histories about what Granada is, because you explained before that before these documents came up, there was not really much known about what was kind of Granada's Christian kind of history, before the Islamic invasion and before the Islamic takeover of the region. And a lot of these these writers are trying to define what Granada is, because these people are trying to say like, oh, my city's cool, or like this is kind of going on not only in Spain but just throughout kind of early modern Europe, right? So can you kind of explain what does these documents help these writers kind of explain who they are, and then also kind of I guess that we'll start with that, and if I have any questions, we'll carry on with that.
Sure. So it's for precisely the reasons that you just laid out, right? For the early centuries of Christianity in the Iberian Peninsula, there just aren't a lot of records, and this is very frustrating to early modern historians. Like they want to be able to say this, what happened in the 2nd century, what happened in the 3rd century. There's just not a lot of records. As you get into the Visigothic period, so like the 6th century, 7th century, there's a little bit, but there's just not a lot, right? So for the period that a lot of these historians are interested in, there's not a lot. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of attempts to apply like what biblical history to the peninsula. And this is happening everywhere, as you rightly note, right? But there's just not a lot of sources. And there is a kind of tendency to fill in the blank with what we might call invented history. And another word for that might be forgery, right? So there's a really famous set of forgeries by a Jesuit from Toledo, and his name is Jerónimo Román de la Higuera. And he creates a set of bogus documents that are grounded in like names that were known. Like you have a name of an author who gets mentioned in a known and vetted source, but we don't have that author's texts, right? We have the name. So that's the kind of thing that these Renaissance forgers would do. They would take a known name, and he gets so-and-so gets mentioned, and the mentions that the text deals with X or Y. Well, then the forger creates that text, right? So Jerónimo Román de la Higuera, for the most part, takes names and creates documents to go with the names. Right. And what those documents do is fill in the gaps. They give the historians what they were hoping for. And they are incredibly successful, the forgeries, right? Yes, there are critical voices going, no, this is really problematic. This doesn't work for the following reasons. And they're, but all these like local historians, I mean, think about my favorite example is in class when I teach is to use the example of Davis itself, right? Okay, so imagine that, we know nothing about Davis's history prior to, 1900, but we've had some names of some people who might have written some things. So you see these people creating historical sources that would fill in the gaps. And now all of a sudden, if you wanted to write a history, if you're a local historian, you want to write a history of Davis, well, now you have some sources. Hooray, everybody's happy, right? My colleague, Katrina Olds, wrote a fantastic book on this. She's just, it's just like top notch. So what the lead books do, the lead documents, the plomos do, is essentially that. They fill in the gaps. And they fill in the gaps in ways that both meet the expectations of local scholars, but also don't, right? So they meet the expectations in terms of providing the early Christian history that they wanted. And the texts themselves, if you go to Granada once COVID is over and you go to the Abadía del Sacromonte, which is where they're held, right? You'll see them, and they look a lot like documents that were discovered we're pre-archaeology, like as a discipline here. It's just getting started, but farmers and people would often like accidentally dig up stuff, right? Because if you're living in a place where there's been thousands of years of human habitation, you're going to dig up stuff. And so people would occasionally bump into these tablets and also lead documents that were written by the pre-Roman inhabitants of Iberia. And these are in a variety of languages. Many of them have not yet been deciphered, right? So you can go to archaeology museums throughout Spain and you'll see these things, right? And they look very similar to my 16th century forgeries. So there's very clearly that the forgers had these things in mind, because these things, you're a farmer, you're out plowing your field, you bump into some stuff, and there's this weird document. I don't know. I can't read it. I can't read anyway, but I'm going to sell it to that rich guy down the road because I heard he collects stuff, right? So that's how these things would wind up in the hands of scholars, and they can't read them, but there's a kind of they know what they look like. So that the plomos echo those expectations in terms of their physical appearance and the kind of the way the script looks. On the other hand, they don't conform to what was expected because they are in Arabic. Right?
Yeah. And then one of the cool things I kind of found was that, like, I think you kind of explained in the introduction that before, when it comes to these documents, that a lot of the history be like, is it true? Is it right? Who forged it? And stuff like that. But you're not really interested in that question. What you're really interested in is kind of like, how was these documents kind of used to explain how people explain themselves, essentially, right?
That's right.
And it's interesting because, like, I think a lot of times when people think about like in terms of like myth versus fiction or whatever, that like historians deal with, facts and only facts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you kind of use how people. It doesn't really matter in a sense like what is a fact to them or what fact to us. Or what matters more is like what did they see as true and not true.
That's
And
right.
and so it was funny because I have this. I do a little bit of this, a little bit of kind of myth history, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, and so this is from Alessandro Portelli, The Peculiarities of Oral History, which we found in the History Workshop Journal from autumn of 1981, and that's issue number 12, I believe. And this is
Hmm.
one thing that stood out to me. This is about oral history, but I think you can talk about a lot of things, not only just out of oral history. On page 100, he writes, "The credibility of oral sources is a different credibility. The examples I have given above show how the importance of oral testimony may often lie not in its adherence to facts, but rather in its divergence from them, where imagination, symbolism, desire break in. Therefore, there are no false oral sources. Once we have checked their factual credibility with all the established criteria of historical theological criticism that apply to every document, the diversity of oral history consists in the fact that untrue statements are still psychologically true, and that these previous errors sometimes reveal more than factually accurate accounts." I don't know
Yeah.
if you kind of see in that way as well that like.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite true. I think it's really an error to think that historians are always interested in fact,
Mhm,
right? And it's often, first of all, what is a fact and how does it become one? That's a whole nother issue, right?
mhm,
And who gets to decide what is a fact?
mhm,
That's one thing.
yeah.
But the other thing is it's often more interesting to accept a source as for what it is and see what it tells you about what people thought was true,
Mhm,
right? So I'm not in the slightest bit interested in whether or not they're forgeries. I know they're forgeries. I don't care. That's fine, right?
mhm,
It's more interesting to me to see what did people say about them, right? It's really limiting. It's honestly to me really boring
mhm,
to be say, well, did it happen this way or not? Right? It's more interesting to say, you say it happened this way. Tell me why you think that.
mhm,
Tell me what goes into your thinking. Let's unpack what's around your belief,
mhm,
right? Um, so I deal with this a lot in my classes, right? That my students come in and expect that the class is going to be about memorizing a lot of stuff. And I'm not going to lie, if you want to do well in a history class, there is a certain amount of stuff you're going to have to memorize. That's
mhm,
just true, right?
mhm,
But I don't really care. It's more interesting to me and more useful for students to understand why something is important or why people say it's important,
mhm.
right? So it has a lot more to do with what people say than a kind of really outdated, very 19th century notion of what really happened,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that just opens up a whole bunch of bounds of looking at the past and kind of understanding how these people thought and who they are. Let's see, we have 148. We even touched on this. We'll see how far we can go. Um, so the one thing I found was really interesting was, I'm really interested in nationalism, and you do kind of mention that this project is in a sense talking to it, but in a
Mm-hmm.
very different way. You kind of look at this idea of, local nationalism as opposed to like this larger kind of view of nationalism. I
Mm-hmm.
guess, how do the two ideas connect? Because I think in my view, it's like, well, micro history is cool, but like, don't you miss out like a lot of other stuff that's going on around Spain, if we're looking at Spain as a country or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of explain that dichotomy and how you see this small picture working out to this much larger picture that is Spain and how Spaniards
Sure.
identify themselves?
Well, first of all, I would argue that nationalism as an ism doesn't really work or apply for the period that I'm talking about, right? That people will identify themselves in certain circumstances, right? So if I'm from Granada and I'm in Milan, or just to give it actually plausible example, right? I might say, I am a Spaniard, I am Spanish, right? But that's not the same thing as nationalism, not in the slightest, right? That it doesn't have the same weight and valence and deep sense of identification. That what is more, that's I'm not going to say it's a generic marker or a generic identifier, but I don't really truly don't think that that applies. And that for the period we're talking about, while there is that in certain circumstances sense of identity, that it is a much more powerful identity for people to speak of their region or to speak of their province. When you look to literary sources, or you look, in general, people will say, well, what is your patria, right? To use the Spanish word, what is your place? And people will say the name of their hometown, right? They don't say Castile, they don't say Aragon, they don't say, and that's actually, I think it's also true. We find the same thing in other parts. This is not a Spanish thing. You'd see the same thing if we were talking about France. You'd see the same thing if we were talking about England, right? Whatever. So I can't really be on board with the sense that the nation is that degree of important, right? It just doesn't seem to me to be at all.
Yeah, I think what you do talk about is there is a connection to a wider some type of Spanish identity, right? Because you say that like, a lot of people one of the big things is that they say like, oh, the king is like this great person, like the Spanish king is amazing, and like there's other people, like even though like they would write kind of these histories about who they are, they're still like, well, we're still part of the Spanish kingdom, the Spanish king is still the greatness. I would argue that maybe that's something, a connection, a cultural connection that can tie to this idea of nationalism, but I digress. I don't know if it's,
I think I would have to disagree with you about whether that constitutes nation, right? I think that I would have to disagree that is not the same thing as nation or nationalism. That
of course,
that comes a lot closer to what John Eliot called composite monarchy, right? So that's a sense of affiliation. That's a loyalty to the monarch, not to the nation, right? My Philip II is the greatest. He's my king, right? That's not an affiliation with nation. That is a statement of loyalty to the monarch. And when we look at the monarch, how does the monarch? You've read, Eliot, right? The composite monarch idea of all of these different entities put together, but the borders remain between them, that they are brought together and united only insofar as they are in the person of the monarch, given a chance, they'll just go all their own ways, right? So
yeah, and I think just to kind of maybe end the point a little bit is that you kind of show, I think we'll just read the one point you have. You write in your introduction on page Roman numeral XVIII, this local take on the recent focus on the cultural constitution of communal identities contributes importantly to the overall discourse in that these lower level affinities often complement but sometimes conflict with national identities, and the attention to them may highlight the contingent characteristics of communal constitutions. So that's what you're kind of saying, is that like just looking at the local level kind of just, it only adds to kind of maybe how these local identities might kind of attach themselves to other identities, but also how they kind of differ themselves as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that also that the sense of affiliation is itself extremely contingent and context specific, right? Who I say I am at one moment may not be the same way I describe myself at the next moment. May have a lot to do with where I am, what I'm doing, and who I'm with, right? And I think we tend to assume an awful lot about the nation, that it's such a ubiquitous thing for us that it's really hard for us to get beyond it, right? And I really just don't think it works for the period. I think it's a red herring.
Before you go, just have you heard of the book called Ethnic Origins? The Ethnic Origins of Nations. Have you heard about that book?
Which one? It's been a while since I've been up on the nationalism literature.
Anthony D. Smith.
Oh yeah.
Pat got me onto that. I'm like, okay, I see where you're going.
Yeah. But again, I think he's like Smith and stuff, like a lot of, yes, like the ethnic origins of it, but that's not the same. That's like the beginnings of it, right? But it's not the same. So.
No, brilliant.
It's been a while since I've read that. It feels like a pop quiz.
Yeah. No, because I was gonna say, because I was talking to Dr. Pack, Sasha Pack, who me and you, Professor, know very well, and he's my mentor for everyone. He's my advisor at UB for graduate school, so that's who he is. And I was talking to him about it, and he says, I know you mentioned Benedict Anderson in your work, and he's very kind of, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he says it's a bit too postmodern, and he kind of introduced me to this book, so I'm kind of get into it. I'll try to get Dr. Pack on the podcast to kind of explain himself on that one. I'm not going to try to speak for him on those ends.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing I kind of want to talk about, and just really quick, when it comes to Smith, I'm still kind of getting used to him, so I can't really make a point if he's right or wrong, but it's really interesting stuff on that end. So the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to this book is kind of like, how can this kind of, what's the word? How can this tell us about kind of memory and in identity in kind of like, let's say like us in the United States right now? I know that in your kind of, I think it's the chapter where you talk about how like civic identity and how kind of, I just want to read because I really like what you had to say on this. Let's find the quote real quick. So in this part, you kind of talk about how even though that a lot of the people you are mentioning in this work are kind of these elite people who are like scholars or like people who are high in the church, classical people who with offices in those spaces. But in the last part, you kind of talk about how, like, I think you mentioned as well, how through like festivities and through like these public sermons that the public start to kind of get a sense of what their identity is. And we see with the Flomos and what the scholars do starts to kind of interact with these public sermons, and this is how it trickles down to like the lower classes, right? Is that what you say further?
Yeah, that there are, while these are discourses that are being developed by the educated, by elites, that there are lots of places where we can see these ideas, this language being broadcast and made available. And we're dealing with a period in which most people are illiterate. We don't have direct access to what they thought, what they would have said. We have to use indirect means. And sometimes, so sermons are a really great way to do that kind of thing, to get at what people would have heard.
Yeah, and so I like, in terms of how this can connect to us, I like this part you introduced. I'll kind of read it. This is on page 106. Right? The sources from which people draw the images and ideas with which they imagine their community, both past and present, can be diverse in the extreme. Speaking of 20th century Americans, the historian Carl Becker observed that people patched the past together from things learned at home and in school, for knowledge gained in business or profession, from newspapers glanced at, from books, yes, even history books, read or heard of, from remembered scraps or of newsreels, or educational films, or extra cathedra utterances of presidents and kings, from 15-minute discourses on the history of civilization broadcast by courtesy of Pebasant, the Belova Watch Company, or the Shepherd Stores in Boston. Much the same can be said for early modern Grenadians, to whom the annual reenactment and oratorical interpretation of Granada's semi-legendary conquest offered an important source for ideas and images which they imagine their city and themselves. And I think that's really cool because, like, even though this place is kind of taking place in somewhere very far away from the United States, even far away from like 20th century United States, we can see a lot of the processes that people kind of gain their ideas and start to kind of understand themselves. It's kind of like this. There's still a connection there in that way.
I think you're absolutely right that we would be mistaken to assume that the way that people construct historical narratives in their heads is exclusively what they learn from books or is exclusively what they learn in school. That's just not the case, right? And that we're like magpies in a sense, right? Like we pick up things that are shiny and we put them together, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the narrative is coherent, but there is a narrative in the way it's cobbled together, and a lot of it has to do with where are the pieces that people are cobbling together their understandings and ideas. And it can be all over the place, you know.
I think there's the anthropological saying where, like, sometimes you're like, if you're trying to study your own culture, it's like you're in like trying to be like a goldfish in a water tank, I believe. It's almost like it's like you can't really tell the difference because you're so immersed in where you are, and it's really hard to kind of pull yourself away because it's like you're always interacting with those images and those types of things. That
I think you're quite right. And this is one of the advantages. I mean, as historians, our work is difficult because, you know, usually, I mean, and if you're doing fairly recent stuff, that's not the case. If you're doing things where you can do oral histories, you know, for example, that may not be the case. But for a lot of us, you know, our informants are good and dead. And there's no way to interview them. So in a sense, like, we have the advantage of being distant in time. I've always thought that what anthropologists do, especially if they're studying their own society, but sociologists, folks like that do the work of analysis upon the society in which they're immersed is so much harder than what I do, because I don't know. I can't. I need everybody dead. I need, that sounds wrong. I need, it's all moving too fast for me. And I need it to have stopped already so that I can pick it up and look at it from all sides. But I'm utterly incapable. You know, past experience has taught me that I'm not capable of, I'm always like 3 steps behind the rest of everybody else because I don't know, it's going too fast, right? So, you know, and I think that's, I can only speak for myself. I don't know that that's true for all historians, but I can't. And so that's an advantage that we have. We can step back. That's also a disadvantage in some ways because you have to imagine yourself into a world that is not yours. And you have to be careful, especially, you know, if you're working in 2021 and you're studying 1960, it's way too easy to accidentally assume a kind of set of similarities, right? The further back I go, the easier it is for me to separate myself, but it's also harder in terms of having to imagine myself into a very different world. But at least I know that it's a different world. I don't accidentally make the mistake of assuming that my values are the values of my informants.
Yeah, no, totally. That makes total sense. Dan, do you have anything to add on that? Seeing as you do study American history and coming from that view, any thoughts on that, or you're good to go?
I'm good.
Okay, coolio. So I think we've touched on this book a lot, but I want to just kind of finish off and look at kind of how this book has kind of informed your work you've done recently.
Sure.
Judging from a lot of the titles and the text, especially just taking a look at the last thing you published, I can tell that one thing that it's kind of continuous is kind of the importance on religion, and also like the importance of relics have to play in what they tell us about the world around us. Is that fair to say?
That's accurate. Yeah. So when I finished that book, I had already launched into another project, which didn't work out for reasons. Basically, I got really interested in the rediscovery of the Roman catacombs. They were never actually lost, but in 1578, sorry, I have to remember.
Dan can check things out. In case
it's okay. It's like 1568, 1578. I always get confused. There was a discovery in Rome of a catacomb that had been forgotten. And everybody got super excited about it. And then catacomb relics started being shipped out all over the globe. And I got really excited. Sorry, cat. I got really excited about studying that and studying the way that catacomb relics in their sort of expansion around the globe were representative, or a good way of getting at the increasing global quality of Catholicism.
Yeah.
So I spent a year in Rome beating my head against the wall trying to make this happen, and it turned out to be really, really, really hard to do. I still think I'm right, but I couldn't write the book. And so that book metamorphosized itself into a different book, which was, I got interested in the epistemological question of how do you know something is holy? And that's still what I'm interested in. But so I tried to write a book, and it was going to be this massive tome, and then it was no fun to write, on basically how early modern Catholics dealt with that problem, right? So like, do you if I say this is St. Cuthbert's cell phone, how do you know? Do you believe me, right? Or if it has a little tag on it, is that good enough? Or what if it's supposed to be like, does it have to do a miracle? Well, then how do you know a miracle is a miracle? Could you please, Kat? How do you know a miracle is a miracle? What are the criteria for deciding when something is real and something is not? And it's actually a really characteristically common problem of the early modern. Long story short, I tried to write that book, and I couldn't write it, and I had a really bad problem with it. Wasn't writer's block so much as like I didn't want to write another book that was going to be read by like 10 people, right? All of whom I already know, because we all go to the same conferences and we all read each other's stuff. And I've probably been on a panel with them before, and they're lovely people, but there's got to be more to life than this. So, long story short is, after much wandering in the desert, metaphorically speaking, I hit upon a solution, and I hope to God it works. And that is, I'm doing the same questions, the same epistemological questions, but I'm doing it through a case study, a single case study. And it is the case study of a set of relics that were stolen in Rome. So like two friars of members of this religious order called the Trinitarian Order. And the Trinitarian Order is founded in the late 12th century, and its particular mission was to redeem Christians who'd been taken captive in the cross-Mediterranean slave trade. And so they're held captive in places like Morocco and Tunisia. And that's a thing, and I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, the founder of this order dies in 1213, but the friars never get around to having him formally canonized. As far as they're concerned, he's a saint, but they never actually present the case in Rome to the Pope to be canonized. So in 1655, two members of the order basically break curfew, tiptoe across Rome, bust into a church, like they climb through, it's breaking and entering. And they take a crowbar and they bust open his tomb, and they steal his remains, his bones.
Yeah.
They didn't think to bring a bag with him, so they end up putting it in one of them's underwear, which is a whole nother issue. But this is theft. This is a serious crime. It is a religious crime. It is also, I mean, it's a crime in many different ways. And the problem is that if they had done this legally, somehow like remove these objects and move them legally, then there would have been a notary, right? There would have been a record, there would have been witnesses. But without a record, without a witness, there's no record to prove that the bones that they say are the bones of the saint, and his name is San Juan de Mata, or Saint John of Mata.
Yeah.
To prove that the bones that they say are his are actually his, right? They basically sneak them out of the Rome and they take them to Madrid. And so then you have this issue with, say, these bones of Madrid, we say that they're the same ones that were in Rome. And Rome is, basically the papal administration is like, prove it.
Yeah.
Right. So then there's 70 years of lawsuit. And it's not resolved until 1721. And the case goes up before the authorities in Rome 3 times, and it's shot down twice, and only in the 3rd instance does it succeed, and that's probably because it was politically expedient. And so what I do is exactly, it's the same question of epistemology, right? Of like, how do you know? But it's a case study rather than like a zillion. I got so much material. I've got so many case studies. I'm up to my elbows in dead bodies, but I didn't want to write that book. So this is a case study instead, that examines the way in which the order made its arguments to prove that they're the same and that they are the bones of this saint. So it's had me doing a lot of like reading. It's all in Latin. My Latin is crap. So it's gotten a lot better. The
Spanish. I was gonna say, at least you know Spanish. So
the Spanish stuff, that's easy. But the problem is that the legal arguments are presented in Latin, and what are you gonna do? Okay, so your Latin gets better.
I was gonna say, at least you're starting from like Spanish going to Latin. It's not like going from like English to Latin. At least there's a bit of a jumping off point. I was trying to say.
I took Latin in high school, so in theory it's in there, and like I've done a lot of Latin, but my Latin is never going to be fantastic. It's always a struggle. It's a lot better than it was, but it's always like, oh God, do we have to? Okay, fine. If it was, I'm sorry about the cat.
Okay.
If it was Spanish, if it was French, if it was Portuguese, if it was Italian, if it was anything else, we'd be fine. But no. So anyway, it's got me reading a lot of like moral philosophy, moral theology, casuistry, like hardcore theology stuff, which is hard, but it's been really interesting. And so the article that you saw was about a concept that is used in the arguments, and it's a concept called moral certainty. And the idea here is that the question is one of doubt, and how there are different kinds of certainty that one can bring to a question, right? So mathematical certainty is absolute certainty, right? I know that 1 + 1 is always going to be 2.
Yeah.
Right? That's mathematical certainty. Then there are other degrees of certainty, and then there's something called moral certainty. And moral certainty is the kind of certainty in which there is an explicit recognition that you might be wrong. You're like 99.9999% sure, but there is an acknowledgement that you could be wrong. And then part of the reason why you could be wrong is because your sources are human. Human beings make mistakes. Math doesn't make mistakes. Humans make mistakes, right? So if your sources are human, like your informants are human, or it's human created, historians, for example, we could get it wrong, right? So there's this recognition that moral certainty is going to be sufficient, perhaps. And that's what they make this argument in the case. And it turns out that moral certainty is a common concept in the 17th century. So we find it in casuistry, which is like you might think of that as the science of the conscience, right? You find it a lot in law. So it's similar in the Anglo-American legal tradition. It's similar to reasonable doubt, right? So, there's a chance I could be wrong, but it's a reasonable thing to go forward with this, right? So, and you find it in early modern science. So there's a lot of, so it turns out in a sense that relics are a great place for looking at all kinds of different parts of the 17th century intellectual apparatus.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, because I'm reading it and kind of listening to you as well, it feels somewhat like not too different from how science and how, I guess, historians kind of think, in the sense that like science and historians like to say this is truth, but it doesn't leave out the idea that they could be wrong and more kind of knowledge can be put upon whatever was put upon. I don't know if I'm reaching too far or
no. That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And that so there's a potential for being wrong, and it's built into the system, right? Science builds that into the system, but that is part of the development of early modern science, right? That it's that idea of building that into the system. So but this is never like, so it's well known for people who study early modern science. It's well known in other areas, but it's never really been explored in this venue. And so it was really interesting to me to find out that, this is a thing. And here it is played out in these other ways. Like I showed the article to one or two people who are like specialists in early modern science, and they're like, yeah, so I'm like, no, you're missing the point. You're right. Like, to you, it's so, but like, it's not really been understood that this is operative in this other area, right? So when you find a concept that is so versatile and you find it being played out in lots of different arenas, well, that's something to think about. That probably tells you something about what's going on in terms of a larger intellectual climate. I am not an intellectual historian, by which I mean I'm like my area of focus has never been intellectual history. And in fact, like the field I did in graduate school in intellectual history was, oh God, it was so awful. So like for me, this has been pulling teeth. It took me, I don't even want to tell you how many years to write that article, because I'm like just completely all new to it.
Yeah.
But there it is, and I think it works. So
no, I think that's really cool, and I think even like this idea of like when people think of science, they think of like, oh, science is like, it's hard science, like it's always right. Where it's like, well, no, it's very fluctuating. It's very kind of like it changes over time, and I think, and to say that the science is like modern, it kind of points to, well, there was already systems put in place even in the early modern period that like they're already thinking in this way. They just didn't call it like science, I guess.
Well, they're starting to call it that, but the word science itself means something else in the period, right? But it's all of this is in a process of development. So.
Yeah, exactly. So just really quickly, Professor, how did you kind of, get into history? I wonder, because, or maybe even Spanish history at that.
Well, I come from an academic family. So in a sense, this is all I've ever known, which sounds a little weird, but basically like, you put my extended family together and like, we all talk shop, and we all talk academic stuff. And so, it was a logical thing for me to do. And it's all I've ever wanted to do. That's the only way I've ever imagined my life. And I know that sounds kind of sad, but that's a fact. not wanting to go into literature is like the only youthful rebellion that I ever did. I was like, no, heck no, I'm not going to do a degree in English. No way. And that's rebellious.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. But the Spain thing had to do with, like many people, I did a study abroad as an undergraduate. And I spent a semester in Cordoba and never quite got over it. It was an amazing place to be. And so there we are. It's like my reasons for teaching at Davis has really changed my reasons for being a professor. I mean, when I that was what was expected of me growing up. Like my sister and I, we played professor as like little kids. I don't even know what that kind of game would have been. Does that mean grade papers? I mean, I'm not really clear. But so you know that was not preordained, but it certainly was a thing. But my reasons for continuing with it have changed a lot being at a public university, and that's been super exciting. In the like the experience of teaching the kind of critical thinking skills and critical reading skills and writing skills has really been such an exciting and invigorating thing that I don't want to do. Frankly, I don't want to do anything else with my life. It's really great. And I don't care if my students don't remember the details like that. I don't care. They're not gonna, and that's fine. Not everybody wants to be historian, and I don't want them to be. But I want them to come out of the classes is with, at a minimum, like a basic sort of basic outline, but more to the point is like the kind of careful critical reading skills and thinking skills that we should all have. No matter what you're doing, or no matter, like, it's so important. And so that's what I want. That's why I do what I do.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, just trying to give back. I mean, if you don't learn anything from the sister class, at least learn how to think, at least learn how to write. And
Yeah.
I think that just helps so much, and no matter what you do.
Absolutely. I mean, those are, you may not remember a darn thing about why 1588 is an important year to me. But even if you don't remember that, you will, know how to read, especially something that isn't pre-digested. You mentioned that you took a seminar with me, right? And one of the things that we did in that seminar was work on a longer paper, right? So first of all, not just 5 flippin' paragraphs. And then also a paper that was grounded in primary sources, and primary sources that were not pre-digested, that didn't have an editorial apparatus, that you had to make sense of on your own. Right. And so the whole point, like, I don't think that people are going to go through their lives necessarily writing papers about undigested 16th century sources. Some of us will, but most of us won't, right? More to the point is that I want students to come away with an ability to take a unyielding piece, a document or a memo or a white paper or a report of some kind, and whatever it is, and be able to read it and make sense of it without it having been pre-digested, right? To learn to make your own questions. I just had dealt with a student in office hours just the other day who was struggling with this, right? That, like, the student was basically saying, I don't know what to read for. And I was just like, and that's the point, right?
Yeah.
I can help you identify some of the things to read for, but part of what I want you to learn to do is how to read for the things that you want to read for. Because life doesn't present you with pre-digested material, and life doesn't present you with the questions. You have to make the questions, right? Exactly. So that's my goal.
I remember that project. The only the actual doing the work was actually really cool. The hardest part was, like, you gave us, like, the literal text. So I read something. I forget what it was, like the like the Watchmen, I believe.
Oh, it kicks everybody's butt. Everybody's like, I don't know what this means. And I'm like, of course you don't.
I chickened out. I had to I need to survive this. I found it. One was regular print, but I'm learning my lesson now.
That's fine. That's fine. Plenty of people, so the struggle. I mean, those long S's that look like F's, right? I don't understand why people find that so hard, but that's just me. But yeah, exactly, right? So having to fight with a document that isn't, in a reader or something and doesn't have like an editor's introduction and questions for reading. No.
I'm dealing with that right now, so I'm gonna learn that lesson eventually. So I'll get after it. And then did the interest in religion kind of come off that trip in Spain as well, or did that kind of come later? Or
No. That's been an interest of mine since like forever. But it just honestly, this is going to sound a little weird, but most of my life I've only been interested in things that I'm not. That is like, I'm not, and this is changing right now. But I will say that, like, for example, I can't tell you how many job interviews I've had in which I've been asked, so tell me about how you do women's history. Well, I don't, right? I don't. I'm not trained in it. I have no business teaching it. And I don't. Now I'm learning more about that now, and that's my attitudes have changed somewhat, but mostly I'm more interested in, have historically for myself been interested in doing things that are not me. And so I'm not a native speaker of Spanish. I have had to learn it the hard way by sheer drilling. And I am not a religious person, not in the slightest. And yet that's what interests me. So
respect. That makes total sense. Trying to learn, trying to get something that you're not familiar with and trying to gain something instead of trying to like regurgitate things you already know. I mean,
well, the danger is if I don't know, right? And I'm not criticizing them and saying this, but I'm saying that there is a danger if you're working too close to things in which you personally have an invested identity, then there can be other kinds of aspects or hurdles. There are advantages, but there are disadvantages. And for me, when I got started, I was like, I don't want anything to do. I mean, what am I going to do? Like, only do the history of white middle class ladies from, Protestant background. Like, that's boring to me. I don't want to. I would change I have different attitudes now. I'm trying to explain the past. I'm probably offending people now, but that's
okay. It's okay, Professor. We gotta say what we think sometimes. Oh. Other times, maybe hold yourself accountable a bit. Just really quick to kind of finish up this part of the conversation. So, one thing I think when we talk about, Professor, is kind of like Spanish history within kind of current academia. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of going through it as well. It feels kind of like a little bit of a cult following, especially in the United States. Like when people ask you, like, do I study, like, what do I study Spanish? It's like, oh, okay, like kind of weird, kind of confused, intrigued at the same time too.
Yeah.
I was wondering kind of your thoughts on it, because I find that like it's something that's not really studied a lot in the United States, but I think it does have a lot to offer because it's very much a very interesting and different society that can tell us a lot about us as humans. Would you say so?
It's historically been a very marginalized and not mainstream area of inquiry, which just baffles me every time. I don't get it. I mean, for heaven's sakes, right? If we're looking just at the 16th century, good God. I mean, Spain is the big gorilla of European politics and diplomacy. So why is it on the margins? I don't know. I've never understood it. When 1992 rolled around, right, because that was the big, anniversary of all of Columbus and Granada and the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. Everybody, it was like that was supposed to be the moment in which Spanish history would go mainstream, right? And it didn't. And I don't know why. In part, I don't fully understand why. In part, it has to do with some of the sort of the dominance of things like, the Italian Renaissance as a totem in European history. It has to do with the structure of American history and a preference. Like there's sort of, I think, first of all, a automatic assumption that if you're doing American history, you must necessarily be much more interested in English, British history. And that's not wrong.
Yeah.
That's not wrong. But I do think it's really, really limiting.
Yeah.
And it leads to a lot of serious blind spots. And blind spots, too, for our Latin Americanist colleagues, right? Latin American... I had a conversation one time with a eminent scholar that I will leave nameless, who long story short, the subject was the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? Mm-hmm. So this icon of Mexican identity. And this is an extremely eminent person. He was completely unaware that the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Mexican one, is a Mexicanization of a Spanish version, that there is a Virgin of Guadalupe that is a medieval Spanish devotion. Mm-hmm. And I just was like flabbergasted. To me, this was like that's where Columbus went when he got back from the Americas. He went to the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, there's a weird disconnect. There's a really weird disconnect. That I don't fully understand. So Spanish history is, as you figured out when you were applying to graduate schools, right? There's not a lot of people specializing in it. There's not a lot of places to go.
I could probably count on one hand, probably.
Easily. Right. It's just, and we all know each other. It's just a very small field. And so, but I don't know why.
I think the one thing is that like it's such a small field, but I think it just allows people to grow and do so many cool stuff with it that like, mm-hmm. And I think you can also maybe combine it with other histories. Like it doesn't have to be just Spanish history. I think you've shown in your work that it's like you can talk to French history, you can talk to like Italian history, you can talk to like even Latin American history.
Well, it's very one scholarship is immensely enriched by not being essentially parochial. Right. And by like, if you only worked on the Iberian Peninsula, like that's really limited. Right. So we are trained much more broadly. We're trained in Latin American history. Increasingly, we're trained in Atlantic history, and often have to have a solid grounding in, say, colonial North America too. Right, especially if we're doing Atlantic approaches, we often depending upon where your area of interest goes, right? Yeah. That may also include sub-Saharan Africa. It depends on what you're interested in doing. So the number of people who train in Spanish history, but who only do Spanish, no, that's just. It doesn't make any sense. It's a global empire of the 16th and 17th. I mean, just for the early modern, right?
Yeah.
I'm not talking about modern history. If we're talking about the 20th century, that's a whole nother different kettle. Like that's.
Yeah. I'm on like the cusp of like both. So I kind of have to know a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So
right.
Cool. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Giving us the knowledge, and hopefully we can get this to other people and kind of get more interested in history and get those tax dollars, you know what I'm saying? No, but seriously.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor. Dan, do you have anything else to ask or say? Or
no, it's a great having you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone. And we'll have more people on the podcast, so get ready for the next episode. So see you guys later. If you enjoyed the podcast with Professor Harris, then be sure to check out the fun quick-fire Q&A video we did with her. It'll be released very soon, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification to stay up to date on all things History Made Awesome. Thank you.